If let's kick off. So thank you, and thank you for dialing into this evening's webinar, which is on neighbour and neighbourhood noise. It's the second of the UCNA, the UK Noise Association webinar series. I'm Anne McManus. I'm a data protection lawyer by day and webinar welcoming committee by evening this evening. So and more interestingly, our speaker this evening is Val Whedon. So Val's had a fascinating and varied career spanning the music industry, radio, journalism, and her work's been widely published in newspapers, magazines, and online. She's had 2 books published, The Quiet Guide, and she contributed a chapter to Why Noise Matters. And in among all this activity, she's become one of the UK's most prolific noise campaigners. She's been doing so for many years, and I'm really excited to hear her tell us more about some of the work that she's done. She's made such a positive impact that she was granted an MBE by Her Majesty the Queen. You'll have an opportunity to ask Val questions at the end. So while I'm sure you're going to be dying to chip in and ask as Val speaks, please make a note of your questions and save them for later so that we can have a good discussion at the end. But I'll hand over to Val now. So Val, please take it away.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. Firstly, I thought I'd start off by giving you a flavour of what it was like back in those early days, very early days, back in 1990, when I was forced to move house because of a noisy neighbour. I wasn't going to go into too much detail about the noise problem that I had, because that is well documented, and I will be putting up some bits on my website, and I'll put a link on the UK Noise Association website as well for you to read. But basically, yes, I had this noisy neighbour that moved in next door to us, and we noticed that she was playing her music quite loudly, and we would politely ask if she could keep it down. And this went on. She would turn it down for a while, and then it would come back up, and in the end, it became a full-scale battle between the two of us, and we tried all sorts of avenues, contacted the local council, and they said, we can't help you. We got in touch with the housing association that owned the property that she was renting, and they weren't interested, and in fact we were made to feel as though we were the bad people. So we suffered or endured this torture for nearly a year before we realised that this wasn't going to go away. We were both becoming quite ill over it, quite anxious and traumatised. So we decided to move house, and that's what I did. That was the only way we could get away from it. So we moved to a detached house. We were living in a terraced house, and we were right in the middle, so we couldn't stand the thought of having noisy neighbours again. So we bought a detached house, hoping that would cure it. And for a few weeks it did. It was great. It was like being on holiday, moving to this detached house. But then one night we were awoken abruptly, the early hours of the morning, by a house opposite who was having an all-night party. It was a house that had been up for sale, and apparently it was their farewell party. We did call the police, and I think a couple of other people called the police. That's how bad it was. But they said that they can't do anything. I'd always got it in mind that you could call the police, but no, they said they don't have the jurisdiction to deal with that anymore. So that led me to start to think, well, I wonder if any other people have been through the trauma that we had with the previous one. And being a journalist, my husband Phil sort of suggested to me, well, why don't you write about it? So I thought, yeah, that's quite a good idea. So I started to do some research, and discovered that the law was really quite inadequate. The 1990 Environmental Protection Act had just come out then. It was 1990. And there was also a report, a working party report, referred to as the Batho report, that had come up with some recommendations. I contacted my local MP, or one of my local MPs, and John Cartwright from Greenwich, and he said yes, he'd tried to introduce a private members bill the year before, which didn't really get anywhere, but he said yes, you know, he was looking to give the police powers to intervene. He said neighbour noise particularly, was one of the biggest issues that his constituents complained about, which was quite a revelation to me. So I started to think, well, you know, maybe this is more than just writing an article. Maybe I should try to do. I was a bit of a campaigner. I've always been a bit of a campaigner since I was quite little, but only getting involved in very sort of minor things like road safety or whatever. But I contacted my local paper to make contact with maybe some local people that had the problem, just to see what the feeling was locally. And they sort of said, well, you know, you need something a bit stronger than just wanting to get in touch with other people. So it just so happened I'd seen Spike Milligan, who was a famous comedian, on television, and he was on a soapbox going on about noise. He'd had noise problems. And it turned out also that my husband Phil had taken photos of Spike a few months previously. He was a local boy from where we were, and he had come to the local church to look up some documents to trace his family history. And Phil went along, and he was just one of a number of photographers, took some pictures of him, and Spike asked him to take some pictures of these documents, and could he send them on. So I'd got his postal address. So I sent off this letter to Spike saying, look, I want to do something about noise. I see that you've been bothered by noisy neighbours in the past. Will you help me? A couple of days later, the phone rang, and I picked it up. I was doing my ironing at the time, not expecting any particular phone call, and it was Spike. And he said, yes, I will support what you're doing. You know, I really believe in this. You know, it's a nuisance. What do you want me to do? And I thought, I didn't know. I had no idea. I'd never run a campaign like this. I said, well, I'll get back to you. He said, I'll be your patron. So I said, oh, great. Had no idea what a patron was or what they should do, but I ran with that, and I went back to the local paper and said, Spike Milligan is supporting me with my campaign. And they said, great. Can you have your picture taken with him, and we'll run an article. So I phoned Spike back, and he said, yes, come down on Sunday, 11 o'clock, and you can take some pictures. Fortunately, my husband's a photographer, so we popped down to where he lived in West Sussex, this lovely house, and knocked on the door. It was just before 11 o'clock, so we knocked on the door, and this big wooden door opened, and Spike looked round the corner, and he said, you're early. So that's the sort of character. Spike is quite precise, as I came to learn. Anyway, he invited us indoors, and Phil said, can we go outside in the garden and take the pictures? And so Spike said, why doesn't your camera take pictures indoors? So yeah, he was obviously getting quite irritated. And then I pulled out a t-shirt that I had made for him, and he said, what's this? I said, can you put this t-shirt on for me? And I'd got one. And he said, look, you know, if you need me to do anything, you've got to let me know before. So I said, oh, I'm really sorry, Spike. Yes, of course I will. Anyway, he obliged, put the t-shirt on. We went outside. Phil took a couple of frames, and he said, that's it. Yes, that's fine. And then said goodbye, and he went. We got in the car, and it was about 2 minutes past 11. So that was quite a quick photo shoot with Spike Milligan. But as it turned out, he was the most loveliest, most cooperative person that I could ever meet. He was really supportive of the campaign in the future years. With this picture that I'd got of him, it was put on the front page of the local newspaper, and I got hundreds of phone calls from people with noise problems from the local area. So I contacted my MP again, and he said, well, we should have a public meeting to discuss it. So we had this public meeting in the local council chambers, and again that was very well attended. Lots of people. We had at least 200 people for that. And I came away and I thought, well, this issue really is much huger than I ever thought, that I anticipated. And so I thought, well, I wonder what the picture is like around the UK. So I came up with this idea of putting a questionnaire together, writing to all the regional newspapers around the UK and saying to them, I want to make contact with people that have had noise problems, and I've got a questionnaire, would they contact us? The name of the campaign at this time, well, I hadn't really got one, and then one day a woman phoned me up with a noise problem, quite distressed and that, and she said, all I want is some peace and quiet. And I thought, oh, that's quite a good saying. So that's where I came up with the idea, the right to peace and quiet. So with this banner that I was now working under, the Right to Peace and Quiet campaign, I sent off all these letters. Everything was done by mail those days. We didn't have the internet. We had fax machines, but that was about it. So it was a case of writing things out, sticking them in an envelope, putting a stamp on, and posting them off. Anyway, we got a really good response from the questionnaire. The letter that I sent went in many regional papers, and we had sackfuls of posts come through. The postman would carry, you know, from the post office in big sacks. That's how many people were writing to us. So then I thought, well, what do I do with the information from this questionnaire? I wasn't quite sure. And a friend of ours, luckily, knew somebody who was a professional at putting statistics together. And so what they went away, they took my little questionnaires. We sent out about 500, and we had about, I've got a report, you probably might not be able to see that, but it's called the Right to Peace and Quiet Pilot Study Findings. And she was able to translate my simple questions and with the answers that we got into some sort of statistics. And not surprisingly, things like loud music came at the top of our list, that people said that they had threats of assault, and that a lot of them wanted better regulation, and a lot of them had never had their problem resolved. And that fitted in also very neatly with the statistics that were being issued by the local authorities. They release national statistics every year, and it turned out that year on they were going up in increments quite highly. So with those indicators and with my report, I went back to my MP and sort of said, well, what do we do? You know, we need to highlight that we need better regulation. Even with this new Noise Act, it wasn't really helping people. So he organised a meeting with the minister. His name was Tony Baldry, and together with my MP, actually there were two MPs, because where I lived was straddled between two boroughs. One was Bexley, and one was Greenwich in South London. So we went to this meeting. I put out a press release. I knew that that's how you had to gain attention, and fortunately we had the London television news people followed us, and also one of the things that I thought was quite important was to encourage some of the victims to talk to the press, to tell their stories, because I knew as a journalist that the human interest story was something that the press really loved. So a couple of people would put their names forward.
Sorry.
Okay, right. So we were covered on the London news that evening, and that spurred yet more interest in the campaign. From that, the Sunday Telegraph, of all people, contacted me and said they were interested in talking to me and writing a feature. I also had a phone call from somebody called, forgotten his name now, but somebody was quite interested in joining the campaign, someone famous, and I didn't know who they were, so I spurred their attention at that time. And anyway, I agreed to speak to the Sunday Telegraph people. They came down, but all they wanted to do, and I've still got the press cutting, and it's now known in my household as my Sunday Telegraph face, because they didn't want me to smile, and they wanted me to look dowdy, and they were really sort of trying to put me down, and that was my first encounter with the way that people viewed particularly neighbour noise issues, that they saw people as being neurotic, oversensitive, a bit of a head case if you complained about noise. And I find that quite shocking at the time when the article was published. And on exactly the same day that they took their photograph, my husband Phil had taken a photograph as well to publicise some t-shirts that I'd had made. And it's a completely different face that I put on. So we had some postcards made up, because obviously that was the image that the Sunday Telegraph were trying to portray. From that, we then got contacted by World in Action team, which was a big coup really, because World in Action was very popular back in the day, and in fact when the television programme was broadcast, I think we had about 9.5 million viewers. That in itself obviously spurred a lot of interest, and then I was on this roller coaster for the next sort of 4 or 5 years with media stuff, and there's not many programmes that I didn't appear in. The Kilroy programme, The Time, The Place, all these discussion programmes from back then, magazine programmes, Nick and Anne, yeah, any of these programmes, these morning programmes, evening programmes. I was travelling around the country. I went to Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, news programmes. So it was quite a big roller coaster. But alongside that, it wasn't, I mean, the media thing was something that I was obviously quite keen to do, because I felt that, one of the ways of tackling this problem was to expose it, was to get the issue talked about much more. It's the only thing it was something that I was involved in with media. So I knew it was one way of getting an issue out there, to talk about it in a more positive way, because neighbour noise had been given such a bad press, and we needed to turn that around. When I was looking at doing the webinar today, obviously I was struck by the amount of TV programmes and press coverage that we had. But again, alongside that, we were invited to speak at all sorts of meetings. I was invited out to Europe to address some big conference out there, and they found it quite amusing because they had translators. And one of the comments that I made was that on one radio broadcast that I did in the UK, I was labelled as Britain's #1 party pooper. And when I mentioned the word party pooper, there was an array of laughter around all these different countries. So I'm not quite sure how the translation was made on that day, what the wording would be for that. I mean, jumping ahead, after 5 years of constant campaigning, we did have some brushes with some regulations that they were introduced. A couple of them were really through private members' bills. There were two particular MPs that had introduced private members bill, and the government used one of them. We were quite excited with the first one, round about 93, because the MP that introduced it had said that he wanted his bill to be all encompassing. He wanted, you know, all parts of noise control to come within his bill, which was a huge, it would have been a huge step forward. But then he got hijacked by the government of the day, who were looking for a vehicle to put forward controls to deal with noise on the street. And that was to deal with lorries, things like buskers, and cars as well. People that, you know, had these boom cars, as they were called back then. So we held a press conference at the House of Commons, which we did quite regularly with Spike. Spike was really, really good, and I do have a couple of pictures of him appearing at those conferences, and you'll be able to see them on my website another time. But they loved him for some of the quotes that he gave them. One journalist one day said to Spike, Spike, you know, aren't you being a killjoy by complaining about these people that play music? And he said yes, quite boldly. And they said, well, what do you want doing to them then? And he said, I want them shot, flattened and turned into bookmarks. And of course, those sort of quotes from Spike were brilliant, because obviously they grabbed headlines the next day. The staff, particularly the security staff, loved Spike, you know, because he was such a character, and they really enjoyed it when he came for these press conferences. I don't know if John, you were at one of these. We had one. We held. I think it was about 93, 94. We discovered with the press cuttings that people were sending us around the country that at least 5 people a year were losing their lives, either committing suicide or, you know, being killed. So, you know, these were noise conflicts. So we held a press conference to highlight this. And again, Spike come, but we held this press conference jointly with a number of other organisations that were involved in other noise issues. You know, the aircraft industry and traffic noise, and Nigel with Pipe Down. So it was quite a big conference, and it did have quite a big impact with the press. So much so that the Mail on Sunday picked up on it, and they ran their own campaign, which led to some improvements to regulations. So we did have some successes with regulations and getting some things through, and the other one was the 1996 Noise Act, which dealt with noise at night time. And what was key about that, one of the things we complained about was that you know, there was no independent measurement, so they came up with a measurement, and also that the confiscation of equipment, hi-fi equipment, was not very clear. Local authorities could do that, but it wasn't clarified. So the 1996 Act it allowed them to actually clarify that point, that they didn't have to go to the magistrates to obtain some sort of permission. The local authorities had permission quite clearly to go and confiscate equipment if they felt that they'd breached the regulations. Often they would have to be accompanied by the police. So that's one of the most outstanding things, that we would still have liked the police to have been involved in some way. They did many years ago, but it was changed, and the authority was handed over to local authorities, who did not have a very good record really for helping people with their noise problems, and that is still the case today. we were their biggest critic. We heavily criticised the services that they gave, which again, after many years of meetings and you know, I was quite polite with them. I was not I was never aggressive towards anybody, and with an agreement, they did come up with some guidelines for their officers of how they should define noise nuisance in particular, and to make it a bit clearer. And things did improve over those years. The service that local authorities gave did improve. But then we found that we were struggling, and also the campaign was, by about 95, 96, becoming quite demanding with individual cases. And I found myself really consoling people late into the night quite often, and it was quite draining. So we wound up the Peace and Quiet campaign, and we set up the Noise Network, which was really, it wasn't a membership organisation, but it allowed me to do what I wanted to do, and that was campaigning. I realised by that time that campaigning was quite important, that the media side of it and highlighting these issues were obviously important, but the press will well know, they knew about the subject now, so I didn't have to work so hard to do that. So I wanted to concentrate on legislation and trying to get some improvement. So we set up Noise Network in 97, and it, as the title says, I was networking with lots of other people, and that included John Stewart, and obviously Frank. I met Frank, and he came down to London, and then we met up with Nigel, and then we used to have these regular meetings and to get together to discuss the wider issue of noise. By this time I'd moved into not concentrating on neighbour noise, but widening the brief to encompass all noise issues. And then in the year 2000 we decided obviously to form the UK Noise Association. But I think that the work of the UK Noise Association is really better spent another time, because there's lots of things that UCNA managed to do and was successful with, and but I hope I've covered a lot of the stuff about how I got involved in campaigning, and except I didn't mention about my work as working with pop groups back in the 60s. One of the things I was intrigued about was my response to my noise problem. People, you know, criticised me, saying, "Yo, you don't like music," and I found that quite intriguing, because I love music. I love live music, and I worked with the Small Faces back in the 60s, and lots of other bands as well. And I still am, and I retired from active noise campaign in 2007 to go back to doing music promotion. So I wear two hats really, and I think this is where people get things a bit confused about noise. It's not about complaining about the noise, it's about people being more caring and considerate. That's really what's behind it. And also, as we know, that there are impacts with noise. Noise does affect our health. So, yeah, I hope that people will realise that we have many musicians that contact us that don't like noise as well. So it's not the music that's the problem; it's the people that annoy us with it. So I think I'll leave it there, because then I can throw it open if you've got any questions. I'm happy to answer them as best I can.
Yeah, thanks very much, Val. It was really interesting. So I'm sure there's a few questions in the audience. Does anyone have anything they wanted to ask? Daniel, go.
May I speak? Hi, my name is Dan Fink. I am in Los Angeles, California. I am founder of the Quiet Coalition, which is a pale shadow of the UK Noise Association. We're started 2016, but I wanted to comment about Val's plaint about she and others complaining about noise being made out to be neurotic, weak, killjoys, interested more in our own comfort than in allowing people to have a good time. And there's a famed quote in American judicial language, although it turns out probably was never said by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes on our Supreme Court in the late 1800s. But the quote is, "Your freedom to swing your fist stops at my nose." And by the same way, the way I phrase it is, people can make all the noise they want, just not where I can hear it. The same way with secondhand smoke. I started out as an anti-smoking activist in the 1960s because in college in those years, a quarter to a third of my classmates smoked, and I couldn't afford to get my one sweater dry cleaned every week. So I asked the professor to ban smoking during the 90-minute seminar, and he did. So coming back to noise, in 2019, I published, and this is open access in Proceedings of Meetings on Acoustics, a new definition of noise. And I just want to be, I know scientific information doesn't travel from Europe across the Atlantic to the States and from the States vice versa in general. So this is open access. If you Google a new definition of noise on Google search engine, it should pop up. The standard definition, Acoustical Society of America, American National Standards Institute, ISO as well, is noise is unwanted sound. The new definition is noise is unwanted and or harmful sound, because that acknowledges the vast scientific evidence summarized in the 2018 World Health Organization environmental noise guidelines for the European region, the vast literature that noise causes a variety of adverse non-auditory health effects as well as the auditory health effects. Anyway, so that's the first thing I want people to be aware of. And then I actually served on the committee, but I was surprised when the chair of the committee for the American Public Health Association Noise and Health Committee wrote the new American Public Health Association noise policy statement, which again should be open access. And that's the first definition of, first line of the new policy is noise is unwanted and or harmful sound. So I send that to my English-speaking colleagues across the Atlantic for use. Feel free to use it. It's under consideration for adoption as the definition by the International Commission on the Biologic Effects of Noise. And I'll stop there.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that actually, to change the definition. That would be quite.
Val, I don't know if you can speak up. Can you speak a little bit louder? I don't, because we were hearing Daniel quite clearly. So try again.
I'll try again.
That's better. That's better. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, get closer to the microphone.
Yeah, keep close to the microphone. Make a bit of noise, Val. That's what we want.
Okay. I
Make
think
some noise about noise.
I wonder about the sound because I, a little while ago, a couple of months ago, I changed the sound settings because I was having guitar lessons online on Zoom, and the tutor got me to change all the settings. So hopefully that's not done any damage, just like my guitar playing.
I think, yes, Michael, I think wanted, I think just before Michael comes in, I think what Dan was saying there, the definition of noise is very interesting. And there is still this idea that people who complain about noise, that they are just a little bit odd. Now, it's not always the case. If the neighbor is playing rock music 24 hours a day, then, you know, that's clearly a really big problem. But when you've got a slightly grayer area, it's easy to blame the person who is complaining. It's still around. I think possibly a little bit less in the UK than it used to be, but nevertheless, it's a valid point that Dan is making there. Michael, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I did. Thank you, John. I wrote you back in December that maybe we needed to look at a new definition of neighbour noise and turn into this like neighbour noise violence. Dan Fink, who just spoke then, sort of like looked at it as not only unwanted but harmful, and that sort of like fits in with a lot of the research in terms of neighbour noise basically being high information content noise, and that sort of like was established by Neiman, who actually did the LARA's health study back with a WHO in 2004. And in 2007, which was also picked up by Diana Weinhold as well, who did a paper for the London School of Economics. But I'd sort of like to say is that, you know, if I was to ask a household member to be quiet, they would comply, then, you know, why not a neighbour? You know, I mean, if a household member was to refuse to be quiet, you know, this would be called like domestic violence, you know, if somebody was prevented from sleeping or studying or resting or something like that. So if a neighbour does the same thing, that should be called, you know, neighbour violence or neighbour noise violence. And I mean, I think that maybe with what Dan said is that he's legitimized sort of like the fact that it's not only unwanted but also harmful, okay, and to call it an annoyance or a nuisance or anti-social sort of behavior delegitimizes neighbour noise from my perspective, given its profound health effects, which have been, you know, established in numerous longitudinal studies. So anyway, that's what I have to say. And also, I do like Dan when he said about, you know, your right to punch me stops at your nose. My wife, you know, says that, you know, your right to make noise stops at the boundary of your property. You know, so I thought that was, you know, quite well done. So, but thank you very much. Oh, and I don't have my camera on because it's 3:38 a.m. in the morning in Australia.
Listen, Michael, one of these days you're going to have to organise a webinar and get your revenge on us, so that we have to be up at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. Can I just add one more thing? Can I add one more thing? I think that, I mean, I was just reading Val Whedon's chapter in, you know, Why Noise Matters. And it just reminded me of how, you know, noise just goes back a long way. You know, it was 1939, and she talked about, I'm trying to think of it, Lord Hood, I can't remember, there was a Lord, and I tracked back a British medical journal back in 1935, and I tweeted it, which H.G. Wells attended, and they spoke about, you know, how, you know, about how we didn't have like something to put on our ears to, you know, to close out the noise, and it was quite interesting. But there's nothing new, but I think that maybe if we changed or looked at changing the definition of what it is to neighbour noise, you know, violence, because I believe to some degree that it is, and you know, Val said earlier, you know, it was torture, and you know, we've really got to, I think, maybe try and run with that and possibly change the narrative of what it is all about. So, but anyway, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Michael. I'll come to Nigel and Janine in a minute. I see your hands are up. But it's interesting, Michael, on Twitter, there's quite a interesting response to this idea of calling it neighbor noise violence.
Yeah.
And you know, I've been following it, and it's been a lot of people are relating to it, because certainly at its worst, it is, you know, if you've got somebody playing their stereo system all night next door to you, that really is almost like that is an assault on your being. It's a really interesting thought, and I'm sure it's something we'll develop. Let's go on to Nigel and then Janine.
Thanks for that. Thanks for your presentation. It was really interesting, and from my background, I'm an acoustic consultant, so I sometimes deal with numbers more than with the sensation. But just anecdotally, it was Michael who made me think of. I spent a couple of years in Canberra in Australia, and the local authority there had guidance on their website about how to discuss noise issues with neighbours, and I vaguely remember a young chap coming around and knocking on our door just to say that he was going to have a party that evening and just to be aware of it and really apologetic about it. And it just kind of struck me that I think a lot of issues relate to controls. I've been in a situation where I was staying in a flat and somebody had a late night party, but you had no idea what time it was going to finish.
Yeah.
So having the parameters which this young chap had set of it will all be finished by midnight, you knew that you knew when it was going to stop. Whereas if it was 11:55, you'd be thinking, well, when's this going to finish? So I think some of that, and even from a complainant's perspective, and I've done it myself. If you complain on the first instance, you could be, well, you know, it's only happened once. But then if you don't complain on the first instance, how many instances do you take to complain? At which point it then becomes quite aggressive of, you know, you could be quite upset yourself, which could come across as aggressive rather than assertive.
No, I think that's right, and I think the fact that if you're told, as you say, Nigel, when something might end, you have that sort of reassurance. You almost feel you've got control over the situation. I know when I worked on aircraft noise, when people, the big worry was, well, yes, one plane, but how many more planes will there be this night during the night? They didn't have the control. And you know, as you'll know, that can lead really to stress and ill health. Val, I'll come back to you with some comments in a minute, but I'll just take some comments from people who've got their hands up and then return to you. Janine, and then we go to Paris. Janine, are you with us?
I'm so sorry, I was muted. Val,
Don't worry, we can hear you loud and clear now.
Thank you. It was a wonderful presentation. I'm sorry if there's no transcription, but I plan to listen to it again and transcribe a little bit of it myself. And Nigel, I just want to very quickly say, someone once emailed me a note that someone put up on a shared property saying, we're having a party on Saturday night. We'll try to end it as early as we can, and here's my phone number. It really helped in that situation. I'm the board secretary of Right to Quiet. I have been editing the noise letter for the last 2 years, and I'm a founding program member of the Quiet Coalition. I'm very interested in education and enforcement, like when a noise code is upgraded or revised, there might be an educational session that people are invited to through Facebook and other social media. Is anyone in the UK or elsewhere aware of efforts to add an educational component when there's a new noise ordinance or code, or any other reason?
I don't think there is.
No.
Frank,
Frank, as far as I know, there is not. I mean, there's nothing remotely, resembling that process. No. Basically, what we have, the legislation is basically determined by Parliament. You see, in the United Kingdom, noise, environment is a devolved function. So subject to certain exceptions, for example, noise from aircraft, it's each devolved government which enjoys the responsibility of passing legislation in relation to noise, and that's been the case since 1998.
Frank, you may just want to explain for our friends from outside the UK, the devolved government means Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have got a control over some of their own laws.
And one of them is an environmental law, and that includes planning, waste, noise control, industrial regulation. So as far as noise is concerned, the UK government now doesn't have a great deal of say in the devolved administration, the way the law is actually changing. A lot of it was EU driven, European Union. We've got some EU retained legislation concerning noise, but that with the passage of time will dwindle.
I was going to say, but Janine's point is an interesting point you're making there. That if I think what you're saying, if laws change, and accepting Frank's point, it may be different, maybe more difficult if it's happening with different laws in different parts of a country. But if laws change, that should be accompanied by some sort of education explanation as to what's happened. Just before you come back in, Frank, the example that comes to mind is in the UK, the rules regarding what we call the highway code, which is the code that drivers must use when driving. The highway code has changed a bit, and the rules now give more priority to pedestrians and cyclists. And it's interesting that the Department for Transport has tried, I don't know whether it's successful or not, but has tried to, when issuing the new highway code, to have some form of information and even education to make people understand it. So it's an interesting point, Janina, something we may, I see your point in the chat. At a local level, it really does work.
Yes.
Okay, let's can we move? Our friend from Paris has been waiting patiently. You haven't got your name up there, so that's the only way I can introduce you. But welcome,
Gilles, Giles in English.
Giles. Welcome, Giles.
Well, thanks for inviting us over. That's very interesting. Paris is a very different kettle of fish altogether because our neighbors are cafe terraces.
Yeah,
that's very, 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 very different. You know, the kind of places you tourists enjoy when you come to Paris, and you drink under our windows and you sing until 2 o'clock in the morning, and we're above and we're just trying to sleep. Well, that's a joke, but yes and no. Paris is one of the most densely populated cities in the world, right? This is not very well known. Lots of people think of third world countries, but no. It's because of the habitat, which the way it is designed, and it's very, very, very dense. And people live in places where they can also work and shop and have fun. And all these places, I mean, that's where we live. Right. Now, the Paris City Council has embarked on a campaign against noise. So we think, great, but what is noise? And for the Paris City Council, it is cars, traffic noise. And that's because it serves a purpose, because the Paris Council has embarked on a fight against cars, full stop. So noise, in fact, serves their purpose. The campaign against noise serves their purpose of fighting against cars. Now, you heard because of the pandemic, the mayor of Paris decided to allow cafes to use pavements, streets, and have terraces free of charge. Wonderful. So 2 years ago, well, 3 years ago now, we had about 10,000 terraces, and with the pandemic, we had an additional 12,000. Just imagine, 12,000 terraces in Paris, which is a very small, I mean, Paris is tiny, yeah? Paris is 2 million people. It's very, very small. We're not talking about the Paris region. It's not the GLC. It's just, you know, inner Paris. And the problem is that we are killjoys. I mean, definitely. Unfortunately, Hemingway said Paris is a feast. So the Paris town hall always uses that as a sort of motto. Paris is a feast, and you're just killjoys. And it's really, really difficult to make things move because the town hall will not listen to us. And the problem is that no political party is on our side, not even the Greens, because the Greens in Paris are mainly young, and they are the ones who go to Café Terraces. So nobody supports us. The press is not on our side. The press behaves like the Daily Telegraph or the Sunday Telegraph, you said, behaved towards you back, 20 years ago or more. Very, very difficult to be to have airtime on TV or so quite a tough fight. And just to finish, just one more word. We had a meeting with the Paris Council not long ago, and they said we should really have a study on the impact of noise on residents. And we said, well, you have piles and piles of reports by WHO, and everybody knows that if you can't sleep, well, that is damaging to your health. It's a form of torture. Privation of sleep is a kind of torture. Sorry. Okay, I was a bit.
No, that's really interesting. And what it reminds me of, last 2 or 3 weeks ago, 2 or 3 months ago rather, I was contacted by the chair of the Soho Society. Now, those of you who live in London or the UK will know that Soho is it's Paris-like in the way that there are cafes and bars and residents. And he had exactly the same complaint as you've got, Giles. He was saying that during the pandemic, people were allowed to eat out on the streets in a way that didn't happen before. And as a result, the noise for the local residents was unbearable. So much so that a number of the long-term residents actually just left. They've been living in central London in Soho for years. They were ex-theatre people who lived close to the theatre, and they left. And what he was saying, and it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on this, is that they know they live in Soho. They know there's always been bars and clubs there, but there's been a sort of unspoken agreement between them and the council that the noise from the bars and the clubs and the cafes would be managed so that it was reasonable. And what happened with and I did an interview with them, in the newsletter. What happened with the pandemic was that the noise was no longer reasonable. Those controls, that understanding was gone. Is that your experience from Paris as well?
Oh yeah. Absolutely. And it was even worse because of the difference after the lockdown period, because when there was the lockdown, it was total silence. And then all of a sudden, we had this increase of noise. But then people realized, but it's much stronger than it used to be. So what's happened? And what's happened is that we had 12,000 terraces, and all those people in the street, winter or summer, because in winter, well, you heat the terraces, which is absolute, nonsense as far as the environment is concerned. That's an additional, it's insane what is happening.
Listen, we need to keep in contact, because you know, it might be interesting for myself to speak with you for something for our next newsletter as a nice follow-up to the Soho story.
Well, we have a good website, so if you enter Réseau Vivre Paris, you'll find our
Excellent.
website.
And I think you've probably,
and you can write to me. The contact is my address, and you can write to me in English, of course. So no
great.
problem.
That's a
Right.
mighty relief. I can write to you in English. Otherwise, there's no.
Or in French.
Otherwise,
or in
neither
French
of us
if
would
you prefer.
understand it.
Thank you.
Okay, Val, you've heard quite a lot of discussion here. Any reactions?
No, I just sympathise with everybody. One of the things that struck me was about being realistic with noise campaigning. One of the things that I think I learned quite early on was that you know, there was going to be no time limit on campaigning against noise. Hence why, you know, I sort of morphed into doing the Noise Network, and then obviously a UK Noise Association as well. I remember that very first meeting with the minister, and I've seen many ministers since then, but I bumped into John Connell. Came along to a meeting that followed that, because they set up a noise forum. Now, John Connell was obviously the chairman of the Noise Abatement Society, who was the first noise campaign that was run in the UK back in the 60s, 1960s. And at the time, he was in his 80s. And because I said to him, oh, you know, I didn't think that he was still around, and I said, oh, how old are you now, John? And he said, oh, I think it was something like 83 or something. And I said, oh gosh, I said, I'm not going to be around, you know, campaigning in 30 years' time, and I think I've almost made my 30-year mark campaigning. So. Yeah, it goes back to, you know, this is an ongoing thing. There are new noise things that come along all the time. We still need to raise awareness. You know, that job is not done, it's constant. And also we need, you know, to bring on board some younger people who will carry the banner forward to continue campaigning against neighbour noise and all other noises as well.
Well, thanks very much for that. But I think before I pass back to Anne, I think I would want to finish on a fairly positive note, because I think during those 30 years, yes, we do have to keep campaigning, but significant changes have taken place. You know, there's a Noise Act, which you were partly responsible for in 1996. We've got in the UK now quite much stronger antisocial behaviour laws, which include noise. So in many ways, the laws are there. They're not always properly enforced. That's a real problem. And they don't always deal with every aspect of noise. For example, leaf blowers, for example, tend to be outside noise. Some of the local authorities don't enforce their bylaws very well. But I think there's a recognition that noise is a problem that there probably wasn't 30, 40 years ago. There's in the UK, there's a framework and structure to deal with it, which is in place thanks to campaigners like Val. I think the real challenge now is to make sure that enforcement really does take place. But with that, I'll hand back to Anne.
Well, yeah, just to wrap up, thank you all for joining. We've got another webinar which is going to happen on the 12th of April. So that one's how to deal with a noisy venue. So we've got Nigel Rogers, who's one of the founders of Pipe Down and a member of FACNA, along with Gregory Scott, who's the creator of an app called Soundprint, which helps you measure the levels of sound in different venues. And Chris Pure is going to be facilitating that one. So yeah, it's been great having you all here. Hopefully you've enjoyed it and it's been an enjoyable discussion, and we hope to see you again for the next webinar. So
Okay.
good evening, and see you soon, hopefully.
Good evening. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Just to say to Michael, the recording will be posted hopefully tomorrow morning.
That's good.